The alarms tore through the palace before I even opened my eyes. I sat up in the dark, my heart already racing, and I knew from the pitch of the sound that this was not a drill. 3 long notes, then silence, then 3 long notes again. That pattern meant only one thing in the history of my family. The sky above Ashvale was no longer ours alone. I ran to the tower window in my sleeping robes, my bare feet cold against the stone floor, and I looked up to see streaks of orange fire crossing the night sky like claws raking across black cloth. My homeworld had never been touched by an enemy fleet in 300 years. My people called it the unbroken line. We told our children that no army had ever reached our orbit and lived to speak of it. That night, the unbroken line broke. I am Caliph, daughter of the Monarch of Ashvale, heir to a throne older than most stars have names for. My people are proud, perhaps too proud. We built an empire on the belief that we were the measure by which all other beings should be judged. We did not make friends among the stars. We made subjects, or we made enemies, and we rarely bothered to remember which was which once the treaties were signed. I did not know, standing at that window with fire falling from the sky, that within a single turn of days I would stand in front of my father and every noble family of our empire and say 6 words that would change everything we believed about ourselves. But that came later. First came the fear. My guards pulled me from the window before a stray blast could find the tower. They rushed me down through corridors lit only by emergency lamps, past servants weeping, and soldiers shouting orders that contradicted each other every few seconds. I heard my father's voice somewhere ahead, sharp and commanding, trying to hold together a command structure that had never once been tested by real danger. The enemy fleet belonged to the Dravash Combine, a rival power that had circled our borders for generations, always testing, always probing, never quite daring to strike. We had grown comfortable in that arrangement. Comfort, I would learn, is the most dangerous feeling an empire can have. They struck our outer defense ring first, and it fell in under an hour. An hour. Defenses that had stood for a century, gone before the sun rose. Our fleet commanders scrambled ships that had spent more time in ceremonial parades than in actual combat. I watched from the command chamber as green lights on the display board turned red, one by one, each red light a ship, each ship carrying people I had grown up seeing in the halls of the palace. My father stood at the center of that chamber, his crown still on his head because he had refused to remove it even for war, and for the first time in my life I saw something in his eyes that frightened me more than the fire outside. I saw doubt. We sent distress calls along every channel we had. Old trade routes, forgotten alliance codes, signals scattered toward corners of the galaxy we had not spoken to in years, out of pride or neglect, or both. Most went unanswered. Who would risk everything for an empire that had never once offered friendship to anyone weaker than itself? One signal reached a small ship that had no business being anywhere near our system. I did not think much of it when the report came in. A single vessel, unarmed by any standard our fleet would call a warship, registered to no government, no alliance, no organized military of any kind. The kind of ship my advisors would have called scrap metal with delusions of usefulness. It belonged to a species we rarely spoke about, and when we did, we spoke about them the way one speaks about an animal that happened to survive longer than expected. Humans. I remember my father's exact words when the report reached him. He asked why anyone would bother reporting the presence of a single human ship when an entire hostile armada was tearing through our defenses. I remember agreeing with him, silently, in my own mind. What could one small ship, from one short-lived species, possibly do against a fleet that had already broken our unbroken line? I found out an hour later, when that same ship flew directly into the heart of the battle. I watched it on the display, a small dot moving against a wall of red markers representing the enemy fleet. Every officer in that chamber assumed the pilot had panicked, or was fleeing, or simply did not understand the scale of what he was flying into. Nobody expected what happened next. The ship did not run. It moved between two of our crippled cruisers, weaving through debris and weapon fire with a precision that should not have been possible for a vessel that small. It drew fire away from a civilian transport that had been carrying evacuees from our outer colonies, a transport that had been seconds away from destruction. The human ship took hits meant for hundreds of my people, and it did not break apart, and it did not turn back. I stood and moved closer to the display, my hands pressed against the cool glass, watching a stranger risk everything for people who had never once acknowledged his species as anything more than background noise in the galaxy. The transport made it through. 412 of my people, farmers and children and elders who had done nothing but live on a border world, reached the safety of our inner defense line because one ship, flown by one person, refused to let them die. The chamber went quiet. Even my father, a man who measured every event by what it cost or gained the empire, said nothing for a long moment. I asked the communications officer to open a channel to the human ship. I do not know why I asked. Perhaps I wanted to understand what kind of mind would do such a thing without being ordered, without being paid, without any promise of reward. Perhaps I simply wanted to say thank you before the battle swallowed him whole, because surely, I thought, a ship that small could not survive much longer out there. The channel connected, and a voice came through, calm in a way that did not match the chaos surrounding it. He said his name was Ethan Cole, and he said it the way someone introduces themselves at a quiet gathering, not in the middle of a battle that could end his life at any second. I asked him why he had answered a distress call from an empire that had never once reached out to his people with anything resembling friendship. I expected an answer about profit, or curiosity, or perhaps some misguided sense of adventure. He said something simpler than that. He said someone had asked for help, and that was reason enough. I did not know what to say to that. My entire life, every lesson I had been given about diplomacy and power and the proper order of the galaxy had taught me that help was a transaction. You gave help to gain something, or you withheld it to preserve something. Nobody simply gave it away to strangers who had shown them nothing but distance and quiet disdain for years. The battle raged on around that conversation. I watched him continue moving through the wreckage, pulling survivors from drifting escape pods, relaying enemy positions to our fleet with a clarity our own scouts had failed to provide. He did not fight like a soldier following orders. He fought like someone who had already decided, long before this night, exactly what kind of person he wanted to be, and nothing about the danger in front of him was going to change that decision. Dawn came slowly over Ashvale, gray light bleeding through smoke that hung over the capital like a shroud. The Dravash fleet, having lost more ships than they expected against a defense that should have already collapsed, pulled back to regroup at the edge of our system. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was survival, and on that night, survival felt like the greatest gift the universe could offer. I stood on the palace balcony as the sun rose, watching smoke curl upward from 3 districts of my own capital city, and I thought about the stranger who had flown into fire for people who did not know his name an hour before the battle began. My father found me there. He did not speak of the human ship. He spoke of losses, of ships destroyed, of nobles who would demand answers by midday. He spoke of everything an empire cares about after a battle, and none of it was the thing I could not stop thinking about. I went to find Ethan Cole before the sun had fully risen, more to satisfy my own disbelief than out of any diplomatic duty. I told the guards to let his ship land in the private courtyard rather than the public docks, partly for his safety, partly because I did not yet know how to explain to my own advisors why I wanted to speak with him at all. His ship set down with a hiss of steam and a groan of tired metal, scarred along one side where enemy fire had grazed too close for comfort. When the hatch opened, I expected to see someone who looked the way the battle had sounded, fierce, hardened, perhaps even proud of what he had done. Instead, a tired man stepped down, rubbing the back of his neck, glancing around the courtyard like someone checking whether he had landed somewhere he was allowed to be. He looked ordinary. That was the strangest part. Nothing about his face or his posture suggested he had just spent the night doing something my own fleet commanders would have called impossible. I introduced myself properly, and for the first time in my life, I watched someone react to my title with nothing but polite curiosity, no fear, no flattery, no calculation behind his eyes about what my favor might be worth to him. I asked him again, standing there in the smoke-stained morning light, why he had come. Not the short answer he had given over the comms channel during the fighting, but the real answer, the one underneath it. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered, and something in that look told me he was deciding whether I actually wanted to hear the truth or simply wanted to be told something comfortable. He told me the truth anyway. He said his people had spent a long time being underestimated by everyone who ever met them, and somewhere along the way, they had decided that the answer to being dismissed was not anger. It was showing up anyway, every single time, whether anyone believed they could make a difference or not. I did not know, standing in that courtyard with smoke still rising over my capital, that I was looking at the man who would one day stand beside me on a dais in front of my entire court. I did not know that my father would one day point at him and demand to know who he was, and that I would answer without a single moment of hesitation. All I knew that morning was that an empire built on 300 years of pride had just been saved, in part, by a species we had never bothered to understand. And I intended to understand him. The Dravash fleet did not attack again that day, but everyone in the palace knew it was only a pause, not an ending. I spent the morning in council chambers listening to generals argue about strategies that had already failed once, and I spent the afternoon trying to find a reason to walk past the courtyard where Ethan Cole's ship still sat, quiet and scarred, waiting for orders nobody quite knew how to give him. My advisors did not know what to do with him. He was not a soldier under our command, so they could not order him anywhere. He was not a diplomat representing a government, so they could not negotiate terms with him. He was simply a man who had shown up during the worst night of our history and refused to leave when the fighting stopped, and our entire structure of power had no place carved out for someone like that. I asked one of my father's oldest advisors, a woman named Cyril, who had served the throne longer than I had been alive, what she knew about humans. I expected history, or at least opinion backed by something resembling knowledge. What I got instead was a short list of insults dressed up as facts. She told me humans were a young species, barely out of their own homeworld, prone to conflict among themselves, short-lived compared to nearly every other race we had encountered, and generally considered unworthy of serious diplomatic attention by every major power in this region of space. She said it the way someone recites a fact about weather patterns, without malice, simply repeating what she had been taught to believe was true. I asked her if she had ever actually spoken to one. She admitted she had not. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected it to. An entire species judged and dismissed by beings who had never once bothered to have a real conversation with them. I thought of every human I had ever heard mentioned in court, always in passing, always as a footnote to some larger story about a war they had fought among themselves, or a colony they had struggled to build. Never once had I heard someone speak of them the way Ethan Cole had spoken to me that morning in the courtyard, plainly, honestly, without any attempt to seem more important than he was. I found him in the courtyard just before midday, elbow-deep in the guts of his ship's damaged hull plating, repairing it with tools that looked worn from years of use, rather than the polished, ceremonial equipment my own engineers favored. He did not stop working when I approached. He glanced up, nodded once in greeting, and kept his hands moving across the metal. I asked him if he needed better tools, better parts, anything the palace could provide. He said the ship had gotten him this far, and a little patience would get it the rest of the way. There was no complaint in his voice, no expectation that I should fix his problems simply because I could. I found that strange. Every noble I had ever known would have used a moment like that to ask for something, anything, some favor to bank for later use. I sat on a low stone bench nearby and watched him work in silence for a while. until curiosity finally got the better of me, and I asked him something that had been sitting in my chest since the battle ended. I asked him how he had known which ships to protect, how he had found the civilian transport in the middle of so much chaos, how he had managed to fly a path through enemy fire that even our trained pilots had struggled to match. He told me he had not known any of it in advance. He had simply looked at the situation, seen where the most people were in the most danger, and gone there first. He said it was not some special skill or hidden training. He said most people, if they stopped calculating the risk to themselves for even a moment, would probably do the same thing. I did not believe that was true, not for most people, and certainly not for most of the nobles I had grown up surrounded by. But I did not argue with him. I simply listened, and something about the way he spoke made me want to keep listening. Over the following days, as the palace prepared for what everyone assumed would be a second attack, I found more reasons to visit that courtyard than I would admit to anyone at court. I told myself I was gathering information, understanding a potential ally, doing my duty as heir to learn everything useful about the forces that had helped save our capital. The truth was simpler than that, though it took me longer to admit it even to myself. I learned, in pieces, about where he came from. He spoke of a homeworld called Earth, a place I had heard mentioned only in dismissive asides at court, always described as chaotic, violent, disorganized. He did not deny that his people had fought many wars among themselves. He did not try to hide the darker parts of his history, the way our own court historians carefully edited our past to remove anything that made the empire look less than perfect. He told me instead that his people had learned something from every one of those wars, slowly, painfully, over generations. He said they had learned that no one was coming to save them from themselves, so eventually they had to start choosing to save each other instead. He said that lesson had cost them more than I could imagine, and it had also made them who they were. I asked him why, if his people had learned that lesson at such a cost, they would then turn around and extend the same kind of help to a species like mine, one that had never returned the courtesy, one that had built an empire on looking down at exactly the kind of struggle he was describing. His answer stayed with me for a long time afterward. He said that the lesson was not about who deserved help and who did not. He said the moment you started deciding who deserved to be saved, you had already lost the thing that made saving anyone worthwhile in the first place. I did not have a response to that. I simply sat with it, turning it over in my mind the way one turns over a stone found on unfamiliar ground, unsure at first whether it holds any value, and slowly realizing it might be the most valuable thing found in a long while. The second attack came 4 days later, faster and harder than the first. The Dravash Combine had regrouped, reinforced, and returned with a fleet nearly twice the size of what they had sent before. My father's generals had spent those 4 days preparing every defense they could manage, but preparation only stretches so far against an enemy determined to finish what it started. I was in the command chamber again when the attack began, watching the display board fill with red markers faster than anyone could track them. This time, though, something was different. This time, Ethan Cole's ship was not the only unfamiliar vessel on the board. He had spent those 4 days doing something none of us had asked him to do, and none of us had expected. He had reached out, using channels and contacts we did not even know existed, to other humans scattered across this region of space, traders and independent pilots, and small crews who owed our empire nothing and had no reason to risk themselves for us. 11 ships answered his call. 11 small, unarmored, thoroughly unremarkable vessels, none of them belonging to any organized fleet, none of them under any obligation to fight for a throne that had never once acknowledged their existence with anything other than quiet condescension. They flew into that second battle anyway. I watched from the command chamber as those 11 ships did something I still find difficult to describe to anyone who was not there to see it. They did not fight like a coordinated military force, because they were not one. They fought like individuals who had each made a personal decision to be there, adapting to each other in real time, covering gaps in our own defenses that our trained commanders had not even noticed existed. Grace Bennett, one of the pilots who answered the call, flew her transport directly beneath an enemy cruiser's main guns to shield 3 of our damaged frigates long enough for them to retreat and repair. Noah Whitfield, flying an old cargo hauler that looked barely spaceworthy, used it to ram debris into the path of incoming fire, buying precious seconds again and again for ships that were not his own. None of them asked for payment. None of them asked for recognition. When the battle finally turned in our favor, when the WedHFY fleet pulled back a second time, bloodied and unable to break through a defense reinforced by strangers who owed us nothing, I stood in that command chamber and felt something shift inside me that I did not yet have words for. My father's generals called it a fortunate alliance, a useful arrangement, a resource to be managed carefully going forward. They spoke about the humans the way one speaks about a valuable tool, something to be used, something to be kept close, only as long as it remained useful. I found Ethan Cole afterward, standing near the edge of the docking bay, watching the other human pilots check their ships for damage, offering a hand here and there, a word of thanks that felt more genuine than anything spoken in the throne room that entire day. I asked him if he resented how my people spoke about his kind, as tools rather than as people who had chosen to help. He said something that I have carried with me ever since, something that changed the way I understood not just him, but everything about my own empire and the way it moved through the galaxy. He said his people had grown used to being spoken about that way by nearly everyone they encountered, and they had learned a long time ago that it did not matter what others called them, only what they chose to do. He said the measure of a person was never in how they were seen. It was in what they did when no one was forcing them to do it at all. I looked at him standing there, tired, unremarkable in every way my culture had taught me to value, and I understood for the first time that everything I had been raised to believe about greatness had been measuring the wrong thing entirely. My people had spent 300 years believing that power and bloodline and conquest were what made someone worth respecting. Standing in that docking bay, watching a man who owed us nothing quietly help strangers repair their ships without a single word of expectation, I understood that we had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. News of the second battle spread through the palace faster than any messenger could carry it. By the following morning, every noble family in the capital knew that strangers from an unremarkable species had fought alongside our fleet and turned the tide of a battle our own forces had struggled to survive. I expected gratitude. Instead, I found something closer to unease. The nobles did not know how to feel about being saved by people they had spent generations dismissing. Gratitude would have meant admitting they had been wrong about something, and admitting fault was not a habit our court had ever cultivated. Instead, the whispers in the corridors turned strange and defensive. Some claimed the humans had ulterior motives. Others insisted it was simply luck, a fortunate coincidence rather than genuine skill or courage. A few, quietly, in corners where they thought no one important could hear them, said it would have been better to lose the battle than to owe a debt to a species so far beneath our own. I heard that last comment myself, spoken by a minor lord whose family had never done anything of consequence beyond collecting taxes from a small province, and something in me went cold and then hot in the space of a single breath. I did not shout at him. I did not need to. I simply asked him, quietly, whether he had been among the pilots defending our skies that night, or whether he had been safely inside a shelter while strangers bled for people who had never once thanked them. He did not answer. He excused himself and did not speak to me again for many days. My father called a council meeting 2 days after the second battle, and I attended, expecting a discussion of strategy, of defenses, of how best to prepare for whatever the WedHFY Combine intended next. Instead, a significant portion of that meeting became a debate about the humans themselves, about whether their continued presence near our system represented an opportunity or a complication. I listened as general after general, advisor after advisor, spoke about Ethan Cole and the other pilots as though they were pieces on a board rather than people who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to risk everything for strangers. I listened until I could not stay silent any longer, and I stood and spoke in that council for the first time in my life without waiting to be given permission to speak. I told them that the humans who fought beside us owed our empire nothing. I reminded them that we had never extended a hand of friendship to that species, never sent aid, never acknowledged them as anything more than a curiosity mentioned in passing reports. I told them that if we intended to discuss the humans as a resource to be managed rather than as people to be honored, then we had learned nothing at all from nearly losing everything 4 days earlier. The chamber went quiet after I finished speaking. My father looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between surprise and something more guarded. He did not argue with me in front of the council, but I could tell from the tightness in his jaw that this was not a conversation we were finished having. That evening, he summoned me to his private chambers, and the conversation that followed was one I had been expecting since the moment I spoke in council, though I had not expected it to hurt quite as much as it did. He asked me why I had chosen to defend a stranger in front of the entire court. He asked me if I understood what it would look like, the heir to the throne standing up for a species that held no formal alliance with our empire, no treaty, no history of mutual respect. He reminded me that everything I said as heir carried weight, and weight, once given, could not easily be taken back. I told him the truth. I told him that I had watched a man fly into fire for people who did not know his name, and then watched him do it again 4 days later after gathering others to help, all without asking for anything in return. I told him that if our empire could not find room to honor that kind of courage, then perhaps our empire had built its foundations on the wrong values entirely. My father was quiet for a long moment after that. He had never been a cruel man, not truly, but he had spent his entire reign believing that strength meant never appearing to need anyone outside our own bloodline and our own carefully cultivated alliances. The idea that we might owe genuine gratitude to a species we had always considered beneath us was not something his worldview had room for. He did not forbid me from speaking with the humans again. He simply asked me to be careful, and in his voice I heard something I rarely heard from him, a kind of tired uncertainty, as though the ground beneath his own beliefs had shifted slightly and he was not yet sure how to stand on it. I spent the following days doing exactly what he had asked me to be careful about. I spent them learning everything I could about Ethan Cole and the people he came from, not through the filtered reports of my own advisors, but through long conversations in the courtyard where his ship remained, undergoing slow repairs that seemed to stretch on longer than strictly necessary, though neither of us ever said so out loud. He told me about Earth in pieces, never all at once, the way someone reveals a story they are still learning how to tell about themselves. He spoke of a history filled with conflict, wars fought over land, and belief and pride, centuries where his people had nearly destroyed themselves through their own divisions. He did not romanticize any of it. He spoke of it plainly, the good and the terrible tangled together, refusing to pretend his species had ever been anything other than deeply flawed. I asked him once how his people had survived themselves, given everything he described. He told me it had not been through any single grand solution, no wise ruler who fixed everything, no perfect system that eliminated conflict entirely. He said it had been through millions of small choices made by ordinary people, choosing again and again to help a neighbor, to shelter a stranger, to rebuild something after it had been destroyed, even when it would have been easier to give up. He told me that humans had a saying, something about how the darkest nights produced the brightest kind of light in people, not because suffering was good, but because it revealed who was willing to stand beside you when everything else had fallen away. He said his people had seen enough dark nights to understand that lesson deeply, and it had shaped nearly everything about how they treated each other, and increasingly, how they treated strangers as well. I told him about my own history in return, though it felt strange to speak honestly about an empire I had spent my entire life being taught to present only in its most flattering light. I told him about 300 years of the unbroken line, about the pride that had calcified into something closer to arrogance over generations, about how thoroughly we had convinced ourselves that strength meant never needing anyone else. He listened without judgment, the way he seemed to listen to everything, and when I finished, he asked me a simple question that I did not have a ready answer for. He asked me if I believed my people were happy, truly happy, living the way we did, always measuring worth by bloodline and conquest rather than by anything closer to kindness or connection. I did not answer him that day. I sat with the question for a long time afterward, turning it over the way I had turned over so many of his words since the night the alarms first tore through the palace. It was during one of these evening conversations, as the light faded over the courtyard and the sounds of the palace quieted around us, that I saw something in him I had not expected to see. A moment of genuine vulnerability, offered not because I had asked for it, but because something in the quiet between us seemed to invite honesty in a way formal conversation never could. I asked him, gently, whether it bothered him that no one at court had properly thanked the human pilots for what they had done during the second battle. I had noticed it myself, the way official reports credited our own fleet commanders for the victory while mentioning the human pilots only briefly, almost as an afterthought, a footnote rather than the reason 400 of our people were still alive to hear the story at all. He was quiet for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its usual steadiness. He told me it did not surprise him. He said his people had grown used to showing up in places that needed help, and then quietly disappearing once the crisis passed. Rarely thanked, rarely remembered, simply expected to be useful again the next time trouble found someone else. He said there was a particular kind of loneliness in that, being needed constantly and valued rarely, being counted on in the worst moments and forgotten in every moment that followed. He said his people had learned to live with it, mostly because the alternative, refusing to help simply because gratitude was never guaranteed, felt like a worse way to move through the galaxy. I asked him if he ever wished, just once, that someone would see the full weight of what he had done and simply say thank you, without calculation, without treating the gesture as a resource to be managed or a debt to be minimized. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered, and something in his expression made my chest ache in a way I did not fully understand yet. He said that would mean more than he could easily put into words. I did not say anything grand in that moment. I did not make some sweeping declaration about changing the entire structure of my empire's gratitude. I simply told him, plainly, that I saw what he had done, all of it, the risk and the exhaustion and the quiet loneliness of being valued only for usefulness, and that as far as I was concerned, he would never be forgotten, not while I had any say in how my people remembered this crisis. Something shifted in his face when I said that, subtle but unmistakable, like a weight easing slightly from shoulders that had carried it for longer than I could imagine. We sat together in that courtyard until the last light faded entirely, talking about smaller things after that, his childhood on a world I had never seen, my own childhood spent memorizing court etiquette instead of playing the way children on other worlds seemed to play. I found myself laughing more freely than I had in years, and I found myself, somewhere in the quiet hours of that evening, understanding that whatever this was becoming between us, it had already grown into something I was not prepared to walk away from. My advisors would have called it reckless. My father would have called it dangerous. I called it, in the privacy of my own thoughts, the first honest connection I had ever formed with anyone who did not want something calculated from me in return. The Dravash Combine, we would soon learn, was not finished with us yet. But in that quiet courtyard, for one evening, the war felt very far away, and something new and fragile and entirely unexpected had begun to take root instead. I did not know yet how large that fragile thing would grow, or how completely it would reshape the future of my entire empire. I only knew that I no longer wanted to imagine a version of that future without him standing somewhere in it. The final assault came without warning, 3 weeks after the second battle, when the palace had just begun to believe the worst danger had passed. I woke to alarms again, though this time the sound did not send the same cold shock through me that it had the first night. This time, I woke already knowing what needed to be done, and I moved through the corridors with purpose rather than fear. The WedHFY Combine had spent those 3 weeks gathering everything they had left, every ship, every weapon, every soldier willing to risk their life on one final push to break our defenses before reinforcements from other allied systems could arrive to strengthen us. Their commander, a hardened officer named Voss, who had built his entire reputation on decisive, overwhelming strikes, had clearly decided that patience had cost him enough. This attack was meant to end things, one way or another. I found Ethan already awake when I reached the courtyard, standing beside his ship with the kind of stillness I had come to recognize in him, the calm of someone who had already decided what he was willing to risk, long before the moment arrived, requiring him to risk it. He did not look afraid. He looked focused, the same way he had looked the very first night we met, though something in his expression had changed in the weeks since then. He looked at me the way someone looks at a person they intend to come back to, not simply a duty they intend to complete. I told him the fleet reports estimated this attack would be nearly triple the size of anything we had faced before. He nodded, already aware, already calculating, in his own quiet way, how many of his fellow pilots he could reach in the little time remaining before the enemy fleet arrived. 14 human ships answered the call that morning, 3 more than had come during the second battle, word having spread through networks of independent traders and pilots that something worth defending existed near our system, something worth showing up for, even without payment or obligation. I remember standing in the command chamber and feeling something close to disbelief as those 14 small vessels took formation alongside our own fleet, unremarkable ships, crewed by people who had every reason to fly in the opposite direction and chose not to. The battle that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed before, unlike anything our own military histories described from 300 years of supposed dominance. The WedHFY fleet came in overwhelming numbers, more ships than our own defenses had ever faced at once, weapons fire filling the sky above the capital until it seemed impossible that anything could survive passing through it. I watched Ethan's ship dive directly into the thickest part of that fire, drawing 3 enemy cruisers away from our main fleet formation, buying time for our commanders to reorganize a defense that had begun to buckle under the sheer weight of the assault. Grace Bennett flew her transport in a pattern so unpredictable that enemy gunners could not track her long enough to land a killing blow, using that chaos to pull survivors from 2 of our destroyed frigates before they lost life support entirely. Noah Whitfield's cargo hauler took a hit that should have ended him, and somehow limped onward anyway, continuing to ferry the wounded to safety even as smoke poured from a hull breach along its side. I stood in that command chamber, watching red markers fill the display board, watching ships I had come to think of as more than strangers take damage that made my chest tighten with a fear unlike anything I had felt during the first 2 battles. This was not fear for my empire. This was fear for people I had grown to care about, and the difference between those 2 kinds of fear was sharper than I had ever expected it to be. At the height of the battle, Ethan's ship took a direct hit along its damaged side, the same section he had spent weeks patiently repairing, and the display board flagged his vessel as critically compromised. My breath left me entirely in that moment, and for several long seconds I could not think of anything beyond the raw need to know whether he was still alive. His voice crackled through the comms channel a moment later, steadier than it had any right to be given the damage report, informing our fleet commanders of an opening in the enemy formation that our forces could exploit if they moved quickly enough. He was still flying, he was still fighting, despite everything, still thinking of how to help rather than how to retreat to safety. Our fleet commanders took that opening, and it turned the tide of the entire battle. The WedHFY formation, stretched too thin trying to overwhelm defenses reinforced by pilots they had never accounted for, began to fracture. Voss, watching his carefully planned overwhelming strike collapse into disorganized retreat, made the decision every commander eventually faces when a battle turns against them. He ordered his remaining ships to withdraw, abandoning the assault entirely, choosing to preserve what remained of his fleet, rather than lose everything in a fight that was no longer his to win. The Dravash Combine did not return after that day. Word would later reach us that Voss had been removed from command following the failure, and that the Combine's ruling council had decided the cost of continuing hostilities against Ashvale, an empire that apparently commanded the loyalty of allies willing to fight and bleed without any formal obligation to do so, was no longer worth the risk. The celebrations began within hours of the final withdrawal, spreading through the capital with the particular kind of joy that only comes after surviving something that had seemed, for a long while, entirely unsurvivable. My father declared a formal ceremony to be held 3 days later, honoring every fleet commander, every soldier, every ship that had defended our homeworld through 3 separate battles. I made certain, in the days leading up to that ceremony, that the human pilots were included on the formal guest list, not as an afterthought buried somewhere in the credits, but as honored participants standing alongside our own commanders. My father did not object, though I noticed he still spoke about the arrangement with a certain careful distance, as though he had not yet fully decided how he felt about an empire built on bloodline suddenly owing its survival, in significant part, to strangers who shared none of that bloodline at all. The night before the ceremony, Ethan and I sat together in the courtyard one final time, his ship finally fully repaired, gleaming faintly under the palace lights, in a way that made it look, for the first time since his arrival, like something whole rather than something barely holding together. We did not speak much that evening. We simply sat together, watching the stars emerge over a capital that had nearly fallen and had somehow, against every expectation, endured. It was there, in that quiet courtyard, away from any formal ceremony or official witness, that we made a promise to each other that neither of us had planned to make so soon, and yet neither of us wanted to wait any longer to make. There was no elaborate ritual, no grand declaration before assembled nobles. There was simply 2 people, from 2 worlds that had never once considered each other as equals, choosing quietly and privately to bind their lives together, because everything that had happened over the previous weeks had made painfully clear how little time anyone could count on, and how foolish it would be to waste whatever time remained. I wore the small token he gave me, hidden beneath my sleeve the following day, not yet ready to explain it to a court that had only just begun to grudgingly accept the humans as allies rather than curiosities. The ceremony itself was held in the Grand Hall, every noble family in attendance, every fleet commander honored in turn as my father spoke of courage and sacrifice and the resilience of an empire that had endured its darkest test in 3 centuries. The human pilots stood near the edge of the dais, dressed in simple clothing that stood out sharply against the elaborate ceremonial robes worn by our own commanders, and I watched several nobles glance at them with expressions that ranged from grudging respect to poorly hidden discomfort. My father called each fleet commander forward individually, offering formal words of gratitude and small tokens of honor for their service. When it came time to address the humans, he paused for a moment longer than he had for anyone else, and I could see him choosing his words carefully, aware that whatever he said would be remembered and repeated throughout the empire for years to come. He thanked them, formally, and with more warmth than I had expected, acknowledging that our empire owed a debt to people who had answered a call for help despite having no obligation to do so. It was, by the standards of our court, a remarkably gracious gesture, and I saw something ease in Ethan's posture as he heard it, a quiet acknowledgement finally offered after so many years of his people receiving so little of it from anyone. Then, as the formal portion of the ceremony drew toward its close, my father turned toward me, and toward Ethan, standing quietly beside the other pilots near the edge of the dais, and he asked a question that was clearly meant simply as a point of curiosity, an idle remark to close the proceedings on a lighter note before the feast began. He gestured toward Ethan and asked, in a voice that carried easily across the silent hall, who exactly this particular human was, given how frequently my father had noticed me speaking with him over the past weeks. The hall did not go quiet, in anticipation of anything significant. Nobles shifted, expecting perhaps a brief diplomatic answer, an acknowledgement of a useful ally, nothing more than that. I felt every eye in that chamber turn toward me, waiting for whatever polite, careful, politically appropriate answer the heir to the throne would offer about a foreign pilot who had helped defend our world. I did not offer a careful answer. I did not hesitate, and I did not soften the truth into something smaller and safer than what it actually was. I looked directly at my father, and then at the assembled court, and I said the 6 words that would echo through every corner of the empire long after that evening ended. I told him that Ethan Cole was the human I had wed. The silence that followed my words was unlike any silence I had ever experienced in that grand hall. 300 years of ceremonies, celebrations, and solemn declarations had filled that space with countless moments of importance, yet none of them had produced a stillness quite like the one that settled over the assembled nobility in the seconds after I spoke. My father's expression shifted through several stages in rapid succession, surprise giving way to something closer to disbelief, disbelief giving way to a flicker of something I could not immediately name, though later I would understand it as the particular kind of shock that comes from watching your own child do something you never imagined they were capable of, something that simultaneously terrifies and in some quiet corner of your heart fills you with an unexpected pride you are not yet ready to admit. He did not speak for a long moment. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat, long enough that I saw Ethan straighten beside the other pilots, his expression calm despite the weight of every gaze in that hall, suddenly turning toward him with an intensity that had nothing to do with gratitude for battles fought and everything to do with disbelief that the heir to an ancient throne had just declared herself bound to him. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a noble I recognized as one of the more traditional voices in our court let out an audible gasp, quickly stifled behind a raised hand. Another noble, closer to the front, simply stared at me with an expression somewhere between horror and fascination, as though watching a carefully constructed tower of cards begin, slowly, to sway. My father finally spoke, his voice carrying a careful control that did not entirely mask the tremor beneath it. He asked me, quietly, whether I understood what I had just said, whether I understood the weight such a declaration carried for the future of our empire, for the expectations placed on my bloodline since the moment of my birth. I told him I understood completely, and that I had chosen this with full awareness of everything it would mean, every consequence, every whispered scandal that would follow, every noble family that would need time to reconcile what they believed about worth and bloodline with the reality standing quietly beside me on that dais. I told him that I had watched a man fly into fire not once but 3 times for people who had given him nothing but distance and quiet dismissal in return. I told him that I had watched an entire species show up again and again, without obligation, without payment, without any promise that their sacrifice would ever be properly honored, simply because someone had asked for help, and that had been reason enough. I told him that if our empire could not find room to honor that kind of choice, freely made and repeatedly proven, then perhaps our empire had spent 300 years measuring the wrong things entirely. My father was quiet for a long time after that. The entire hall waited, nobles holding their breath, uncertain whether they were witnessing the beginning of a scandal that would fracture the court, or the beginning of something none of them yet had the language to describe. When my father finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier tension, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful, the voice of a ruler beginning to reconsider assumptions he had carried his entire life. He said that he had spent this entire crisis watching an empire built on pride nearly collapse, saved in the end by people his own court had never considered worth acknowledging as equals. He said that perhaps it was time his empire learned to measure worth by something other than the accident of birth. He did not offer a full embrace of everything I had declared, not in that moment, not in front of an entire court, still processing the shock of it. But he did something that mattered more than any grand speech could have. He nodded, once, toward Ethan, and he said, simply, that any man willing to risk everything 3 times over, for people who owed him nothing, had earned a place in this hall, whatever title anyone chose to give him. It was not a perfect resolution. The following weeks brought exactly the kind of upheaval I had expected. Some noble families withdrew their support entirely, horrified at the idea of an heir bound to someone outside our own carefully guarded bloodlines. Formal letters arrived demanding clarification, demanding retraction, demanding that the marriage be quietly dissolved before it could set a precedent that might unravel generations of carefully maintained hierarchy. Other families, quietly, reached out with a different kind of message entirely. Some sent private notes, expressing something close to relief, admitting they had long harbored doubts about the way our empire treated species it considered lesser, admitting that watching humans bleed for a throne that had never once returned their kindness had shifted something in how they understood the galaxy beyond our borders. Cyril, the advisor who had once recited a list of dismissive facts about humans without ever having spoken to one, came to me privately several weeks after the ceremony. She told me she had finally taken the time to speak with several of the human pilots who remained near the capital, coordinating with our fleet as informal allies while formal treaties slowly began to take shape. She admitted, with a kind of humility I had never seen from her before, that everything she had believed about that species had been built on assumption rather than experience, and that experience had proven those assumptions almost entirely wrong. Word of what had happened in Ashvale spread beyond our own borders faster than any formal diplomatic announcement could have managed. Other species, ones who had also long dismissed humans as unremarkable, began reaching out cautiously, curious about a story that seemed to defy everything the galaxy had assumed about that particular species. Some sought alliances of their own, others simply sought understanding, recognizing that a species capable of inspiring the kind of loyalty and courage we had witnessed deserved a second look, one not clouded by old prejudice. I watched, over the following months, as the reputation of an entire species began to shift, slowly and unevenly, but undeniably, starting from a single battle fought over a single homeworld that had never done anything to deserve the sacrifice offered to it. Grace Bennett and Noah Whitfield, along with the other pilots who had answered the call, became something between honored guests and genuine friends within our court. No longer footnotes in official reports, but recognized allies whose contributions were spoken of openly, without the quiet minimization that had characterized those first uncertain days after the second battle. Formal recognition eventually followed, treaties drafted not out of calculated necessity, but out of a genuine desire to build something lasting between our peoples, something neither side had believed possible before that crisis forced us to see each other clearly for the first time. My own relationship with Ethan settled into something quieter and steadier once the initial shock of the announcement began to fade. We did not live inside some grand romantic story, the kind told in old ballads about heroes and princesses. We lived, instead, inside something more ordinary and, I came to believe, more valuable than that. We learned each other slowly, argued over small things, the way any two people building a life together eventually do, found comfort in quiet evenings that had nothing to do with battles or ceremonies or the weight of empire at all. He told me, one evening many months after that first alarm had torn through the palace, that he had never expected any of this when he answered a distress call that reached his ship almost by accident, a signal meant for someone else entirely, caught only because he happened to be passing through that stretch of space at exactly the wrong, or perhaps exactly the right, moment. I asked him if he regretted any of it, given everything it had cost him, the danger, the scrutiny, the strange new life he had been thrown into, simply because he chose to answer a call for help. He told me the only thing he would have done differently was answer sooner, if he could have. He said everything else, Every risk and every difficult conversation and every uncertain moment since had been worth it, for reasons that had very little to do with empires or titles or the shape of the galaxy's opinion of his species, and everything to do with the quiet, ordinary life we had slowly built together in the space between all that chaos. My father, in the years that followed, never became someone who spoke easily about humans without at least some trace of his old caution, but he changed, slowly, in ways that mattered. He authorized formal alliances with human settlements scattered throughout our region of space, ensuring that no future distress call from our empire would need to rely on the chance kindness of a single passing ship, but could instead call upon genuine partners bound by mutual respect rather than desperate necessity. He also, quietly, without ever making a formal announcement about it, began referring to Ethan by name rather than by species, a small shift that meant more to me than any grand ceremony ever could have. I think often about that first night, the alarms tearing through my sleep, the fire falling from a sky that had never once been touched by an enemy fleet in 300 years. I think about how certain I was, in that moment, that nothing could save us, that the unbroken line was about to become simply another broken promise in a galaxy full of empires that had eventually fallen. I think about how wrong I was to believe that survival would come from our own strength alone, and how right I turned out to be that it would come, instead, from something my people had never valued enough to properly understand. Not conquest, not bloodline, not the careful accumulation of power across 300 years of pride. It came from a stranger who believed that a call for help was reason enough to answer it, regardless of who was asking, regardless of what history stood between them, regardless of whether gratitude would ever properly follow. My empire spent 3 centuries measuring worth by the wrong things entirely. It took one crisis, one quiet stranger, and one honest question asked in front of an entire court to finally show us what we should have been measuring all along. When my father asked who this human standing beside me truly was, he expected a diplomatic answer, a careful acknowledgement of a useful ally, something small enough to fit comfortably within the old boundaries of our world. I gave him the truth instead, plain and unshaken, the same truth I would give again without a moment of hesitation if that night ever came to be relived. He was not simply an ally, he was not simply a useful resource, a footnote in some grand history of battles fought and empires saved. He was the human I wed, and in the years that followed, that simple truth became something spoken across our empire not as scandal, but as honor, a reminder that the measure of any person, of any people, was never found in where they came from or what others believed about them beforehand. It was found only in what they chose to do when someone else needed help, and in whether they showed up anyway, even when nothing but their own quiet conscience asked them to.